I'm Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. I'm so glad that you joined us for tonight's presentation. Violence, Greed, and Great Hope, A History in Verse of Frontier Kentucky with Lynnell Edwards. This program is presented through the generous support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and it's sustaining the humanities through the American Rescue Plan Initiative. With this support, the Filson will present a series of public programs and launch Resurrecting the First American West, a digital exhibit on the diverse Ohio Valley frontier. Lynnell Edwards' most recent collection of poetry is This Great Green Valley, for which we will place a purchase link in the chat. She's the author of 3 additional full-length poetry collections and a chapbook, Kings of the Rock and Roll Hot Shot, which chronicles the work and art of a glass-blowing studio. Her work often investigates the deep connections between a people and their place, including the natural, political, and family narratives in its history. She is the Associate Program Director and Professor in Poetry for the Sena Jeter Naslin Karen Mann Graduate School of Writing at Spalding University. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. Please join me in welcoming Lynnell Edwards.
Thank you so much, everybody. I want to start by thanking Patrick Lewis, Director of Collections and Research, and also Programs and Education Manager for the Filson, Scott Scarborough, who is Programs and Education Manager, Scott Scarborough, who's been working with me to schedule and reschedule, and like all things pandemic, reschedule this talk for tonight. I also owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to the extraordinary staff of historians and curators and archivists who worked with me to locate sources and who make the Filson Historical Society the amazing resource that it is. And thanks to all of you here tonight listening and considering how we tell our stories. What I'd like to do tonight is begin by reading from the short preface in the book, This Great Green Valley, which discusses my interest in this part of Kentucky's history and my process in creating these poems. And then I'll read a number of poems selectively from the book, which is arranged in chronological order. And I'll talk a bit about what I discovered and the particular sources for the poems. And then I'm very interested in your questions. So let me begin with the preface. The book but many of the poems are about my ancestors, the McAfee Brothers. And I've always known that my ancestors, the McAfees, were among the very first families to survey and settle central Kentucky, though I hadn't ever thought hard about them until I began researching Kentucky's pioneer history for these poems. At most, I felt a kind of bemused pride every time I passed through the little town of McAfee, set on US Highway 127 between Lawrenceburg, where I spent my childhood, and Harrodsburg, the oldest settlement in Kentucky. Those are my people, I'd think. And then I'd blink, and I would have already passed through the wide spot in the road that is modern day McAfee, and any speculation about who they were would have passed. I don't feel a close kinship to these pioneer McAfees. They are of a different space and time, and they seem to me remote, public. And though I've spent most of my life mere miles from their settlement, I have not thought much about what my relationship and my responsibility to them might be. They are the contemporaries of Daniel Boone, John Filson, Richard Henderson, and other of Kentucky's white pioneers who explored, settled, and wrote about Kentucky in its pre-statehood period from 1760 to 1792. They are part of the hard story of the founding of Kentucky, which is part of the harder story of the founding of this country. When the McAfee Company left their home in Botetourt County in Virginia in early May 1773 on a surveying expedition down the Ohio River, they entered a largely unsettled territory of extraordinary beauty and natural bounty. During this first excursion, the McAfee brothers, along with men from several other families, surveyed and claimed land on the Salt River in what is now Mercer County, granted to them for service in the French and Indian Wars. It took several trips to and from their home, including an interruption of several years to serve with the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, to gather their families and settle permanently. Like many frontier families, their stories first became popular in 19th century collections like John A. McClung's Tales of Western Adventure that seem part Hollywood and part hagiography. fighting against desperate odds, hunkered down in their stations, fending off legions of Native American, quote, savages, clearing land that was assumed to be uninhabited. These were the 19th century reconciling narratives for what was a brutal, politically complex, and racist period in Kentucky's history. Within 10 years of establishing McAfee Station, Kentucky was thick with like-purposed men surveying claims for speculators who bought up warrants and preemptions with unfettered greed at the reports from the Trans-Appalachian Paradise. Daniel Boone, surveyor for Colonel Richard Henderson's Transylvania Company, was among the most famous of them, and Henderson's brokering of the Treaty of the Sycamores with the Cherokee and the establishment of Boonesboro Station is among the most notorious and remarkable of numerous schemes to settle the territory profitably. Betrayals of treaties with First Nation tribes and an increasing and superior military force ultimately led to the ruin of the Delaware, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, and other sophisticated and thriving communities. The McAfee story finds its place in this history of violence, greed, and fear, but also in the great hope that is the story of Kentucky and of this country. It's offered here in a loose poetic adaptation that braids the history of the McAfees into better known accounts of the frontier. The long poem that constitutes the second part of the collection, which I'm not going to read into tonight, is the story of my own childhood and spent pleasure boating on the Kentucky River, safe in the same great green valley the McAfees once claimed. Though the poem recounts a relatively recent time, the deep history in the river and the rocks, the limestone overhangs that sheltered a hunting party, and the fossils embedded high in the Palisades are the ancient record of what our great green earth once was, and where, if we can keep it, we might find our place in it still. So I'll read the first couple of opening poems and say a little about them. This is called Settlers 1. And the person speaking is Jane McMichael McAfee, June 1739. They are coming from Ulster, Ireland. They are originally Scottish. All night on the waters, in rocking, the croup rattles our Malcolm's chest. All night I hear the wet sloshing in his breath's bellows, press him against my chest and feel the fever go cold. Morning, I wind and wind him in his white sheet, release his body to the deep, commend his spirit, namesake of that chieftain what has spawned us all. We lift our prayers to salt spray and the peaks of waves, bow forward toward unrepentant shores. The second poem, chronologically is very, very early, and it recounts the story of John Swift, who allegedly arrived in North America and had a lot of silver, or made a lot of silver, or smelted. And apparently even still in Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, there's a lot of treasure hunting that happens looking for John Swift's silver. The source for this was a very recent, 1970s or so, publication and additional sort of apparatus that is apparently John Swift's journal. So it's all a little bit fishy and all a little bit History Channel-like. Did this really happen? Who was this guy? Was he over here when? And he left instructions sort of on how to find all this silver, but not really. But it gets at what was a founding theme in Kentucky's early history, which is people wanted to get rich and they thought they could do it. There's an epigraph from this alleged journal that reads, "From there through a bluffy region, from there to a cliff on the right, then up a creek, crossing in the opposite direction to the cliff, thence through a bottom by an old Indian graveyard." These are instructions supposedly to where to find his silver. This poem is in his imagined voice. "Ugly business this, dead men and their treasure, my legacy writ. Indian trader, pirate, man of faint allegiance to nation, God, who I did or didn't kill, blood some way spilled to get map or passage to Cherokee, Shawnee lode, primitive kilns that smelt silver from ore. Boone, Filson, Herod, fevered with legend, disappear into this rough and cliffy country. Look for a peculiar rock where three creeks come together. Sign of a triangle, sign of a compass, sign of a trowel and square. Haven't I said enough? I am blind at the end, the dim work of mining, its fires and salts. Or a duel robs me of my sight, the other fellow his life. Still, I point men panting for wealth, south or east, by the feel of sun on my face. Some don't come back, none get rich, no furnace never found, nor counterfeit sack of English crowns. More, Furnace Creek, Clear Creek, Cane Creek. Look for a rock house, look for a hole. It's all in the journals. 50 poles north, look for a marched oak. Buffalo Rock, Sky Rock, Tabletop Rock. Have you no sense, no eyes to see? You'll get nothing further from me. Settlers 2. This was actually the first poem I wrote when I began thinking about this, imagining, and having read a little bit, imagining the companies coming across in the Appalachians and through the Cumberland Gap and into Kentucky and down the Ohio River. Settlers 2. Wild the minds of men, and green as the sun-charged canopy of trees, their fears of depredation and the savage tribes, betrothed left at home and drinking water. Evening, they go into the hollows, the caves carved by cold springs, seek shelter from the beasts, storm cloud and hate. At day, the lilt of their words shock the limestone cliffs. Ash stirred into flame boils coffee, chars meat. Then on to disturb. Rattle, rattle the cane brake, tramp to high ground, hack a clear patch and arm it. And one more from the Settlers series. This is McAfee Company Return, Kentucky River North Fork, August 1773. And I want to say a little bit about the source for this and the process for this poem, because this is a really good example of where the 19th century sources really had mythologized these pioneers and also worked to justify some other kinds of activity and agendas, to say the least. A couple of sources I relied heavily on were the journals of Robert and John McAfee, which were two of the original 5 brothers, that were published as part of a genealogical book. It was called a memorial. It was the Woods McAfee Memorial, published at the turn of the last century, 1900, and written by a paid genealogist. And in it, it documents the family history through about 1900, and then also includes some other things, some hand-drawn maps and these journals. I don't know where the original journals are or what the provenance of those might be. And in the journals, the account of what I want to share, this is a really, you see this story a lot in 19th century histories of Kentucky and as stories of the West, which was Kentucky in the 18th century. And it takes on a really elevated status in the mythology of the founding of Kentucky. And the story is that on their way back, they basically get lost. They think if you know central Kentucky, you know that you can get over there to the Kentucky River and you can get through and you can get back to Southwest Virginia. But they didn't have a really good idea. And so they get lost and they get really lost and it doesn't look so great. And in their journals, they record, I want to read this. We traveled across the worst laurel mountains that I ever saw, about 20 miles, and camped with little to eat. And on the 12th, we traveled over the same kind of mountains, which seemed to us that we should never get out of them. This looks a little discouraging. It goes on to say they ultimately shot a buck and ate it. In about that many words, that's what they say. So the second source that I relied quite a bit on for some sense of the 19th century accounts of these was the life and times of Robert B. McAfee, who is the son of the original Robert McAfee. If you do genealogy, you know how confusing this gets when all of the sons have all of the same four names across generations. Robert B. McAfee, Robert Breckinridge McAfee, is a pretty big deal in Kentucky history. He was an important military commander, and he writes his memoir. The Filson has the original, and it was also it's been published in various places. So when he recounts this, he has the firsthand accounts of these adventures from his father and also his uncles. So he grew up hearing these stories, but by the time he gets around to writing this as an old man, this particular story has taken on epic religious proportions. In particular, the phrase abode of desolation figures in the narrative, and it figures in other places too. The church that the McAfees and others at the settlement there founded, New Providence Church, has a plaque documenting the history, and they talk about the McAfee brothers reaching this abode of desolation, which they describe as pretty discouraging. So classic Scots-Irish understatement here. Is abode of desolation where they potentially meet their end. And in McAfee's account, it's a long account. And I'll read a little bit of it, and then I'll read what I read back into it based on 18th century sources and my sense of the McAfee brothers. So McAfee's son writes, they were in a region of country which seemed to be the abode of desolation, and nothing but bare rocks on every hand, and silence and solitude reigned supreme. Not a living animal was to be seen besides themselves. Even the feathered tribes had fled, and starvation and death was staring them in the face. Their feet blistered, and legs and thighs rubbed raw with scratches of green briars, and the rubbing of the hems of their shirts in the midst of a region of craggy rocks and cliffs under a broiling sun, a scene which appalled the stoutest hearts. Well, it goes on, and the sun is gilding the mountains, and it's looking really bad. And some of the men say they can go no farther. And then Robert McAfee, his father, who was always the most cheerful and athletic of any of the brothers, of course, at last, effort of despair, determined to proceed on, and if there's anything to kill. And so it goes on just a bit, and there's quite a dramatic scene of a shooting a buck, and in other accounts, it's the last bullet in the gun, and he shoots it, and if they don't get this, they die, and they then are saved. So then it says, the sound of his gun inspired new life. They had fire kindled with meat, with water from the little branch in abundance. The joy and hunger combined made it the finest they ever had. And Robert was considered as the Joseph of his brethren, while heartfelt thanks were returned to kind providence. So it's really evoking this kind of in the wilderness feeling. And then the final paragraph, I think, is important too, because it's doing some work that needs to be done in the 19th century in terms of what's going on with Western expansion. He writes, this affair was never forgotten by these men, and ought long to be remembered by their children. That little venison had preserved the lives of their fathers in the wilderness on their return from, quote, the land of promise. Thus we may trace the workings of an all-wise God, who amid the highest points of our western waters preserved a handful of men who were destined to be the pioneers of civilization and Christianity in the great valley of the Mississippi, now numbering many millions. So they didn't just luck out and figure out how not to be lost and kill a buck. They were driven by the very hand of God. So this is my take on the scene there. And I do believe, of course, they were frightened, and it was desperate. So Settlers 4, McAfee Company, return, Kentucky River, North Fork, August 1773. Upstream, let me start again. Upstream, south and east, so winds this current towards its source, so bends this stream into forks. We choose north, scramble over moss and boulder, fossil bed and shale flint, broken and loose underfoot. No Shawana gold at that mouth, no Canaan foretold. abode of desolation, we grow thin and hungry, pitch a subsistence camp, and no one tells how men die squatting and alone. Okay, let me read. I realized, after a bit that I did not have an entire book of poems about the McAfee brothers. They're kind of second level famous. There are, there's more material about Daniel Boone, honestly, and McAfees are kind of second level famous, which also meant for me they were a little bit of a blank canvas. Anybody who treks into the territory of Daniel Boone risks, a legion of Daniel Boone scholars coming after them, to point out what they've gotten wrong. And certainly any kind of imaginative creation about the lives of someone who's historically very, very well known, you have other kinds of considerations. Not that you can't do whatever you want as a writer, but still. But the McAfees were pretty blank canvas. I had enough information, enough research, and I'm lucky in this. I have a very good friend who is Black, and tracing her ancestors is a whole other bit of business. I feel very privileged to have not only access to the Filson, but also such an astonishing written record of my ancestors back to the mid 18th century. But they weren't going to make a whole book. So the other stories I was seeing similar treatment of, which is to say, I would read accounts in primary sources of the day, in journals, in letters. The Filson has a marvelous collection of letters about what's really going on there. And then I read the 19th century, what I call in the preface, reconciling narratives. And so I want to read a couple of poems about that. One very famous story that was written much about is the kidnapping of Daniel Boone's daughter and a friend. And it's mostly written about the bravery of Daniel Boone and the posse of men and boyfriends that apparently go after them, and the heroic nature of the rescue. This was a real threat, kidnapping for ransom. By and large, people weren't always harmed. And this story, again, is much retold. My first thought goes to the mothers and what they might have thought. And reading about what happened, and I'm going to let it unfold here, it's one of those situations where your child has done something simultaneously so stupid and so dangerous that you don't know whether to shake them silly or hug them. So this is called The Mothers of Elizabeth and Frances Calloway and Jemima Boone Embrace Them Upon Their Return from Capture by Indians, July 17th, 1776. So this is the voice of the mothers. How pressed by the heat were you that you thought it safe to wander toward river's bank, there to launch our light canoe, dare each other to tip it? How enchanted, laughing at your game, that you didn't hear the savage on his path. Haven't we always warned you with one ear toward the meadow's edge and one ear toward the station bell to bend? And how long do you suppose he and his band lay at their leisure, watching you, watching the laces loose at your breast, your hair tumbled from its cap in the heat? Do not protest that you were clever as woodsmen to snap twigs, leave your marks of ripped hem, ribbon. Do not think it but God's providence what saved you. Those boys, those yet smooth-skinned boys, hot warriors in pursuit of their beloveds, as though they yet know what love might suffer. To their maids so they flew, and so to your fathers, their eyes blurred with rage and fear did follow. Do not think you are other still than foolish girls, even as you have had your trial, your 3-day tramp through this desolate wild, even as you, Elizabeth, countenance grown dark from the sun, eye and cheekbone shadowed in fatigue, a red kerchief wrapped like a primitive crown around your brow. So but a father's hand, such a beloved, would have cleaved your skull, thinking you a long-haired savage, unholy creature meant to ruin his maid. So fierce those women were. Another source that I found, and I want to read this poem as well, were a series of prints And I'll get Scott to go ahead and post that visual. Okay, great. So this is a series by G.W. Faisal, circa 1850, and the title of the series, and there are, I think, 6 of these. They're called Heroic Deeds of Former Times, and you can kind of see that title there at the top. I don't know if it's possible to make that even slightly larger or not. Don't worry about it. But anyway, these prints were really interesting to me because they seem very stylized and in particular ways. They don't, in my imagination, really look like what was going on. They seem to be a different landscape. This doesn't look really like Kentucky. And you can see that the way the women are dressed, you can see their ease. The heroic deed of former times is the women of Bryant Station, Kentucky, supplying the garrison with water, August 15th, 1782. The story will unfold as I read it, but I'm just struck with kind of how serene this all is when the fact of the situation is they're under siege. If they don't have water, it's really, really bad. And these women seem to be not of frontier Kentucky and not, I don't know, if you see the woman in the background, the way she's carrying it on her head, again, it almost looks Italian or Egyptian or of a sort of classical era. So there's another poem in the book that recounts a different heroic deed where it's the same scene. The painting is just all wrong. It's full of anachronisms and all kinds of things, and it seems to have some other agenda. All right, heroic deeds of former times, the women of Bryant Station, Kentucky, supplying the garrison with water. All of you must go, all of you, the married, the unwed and widowed, the old, the young, fearful and clutching their mother's hems, those afraid and those bold in their resolve or with hope abandoned, do not know fear. You must take your gourds and noggins, pails and piggins, walk to the spring to fill them. The day will be hot and the fires will be hot. The rifles will scald our palms and we will not last the siege without water. More, you must deceive the savage what waits, hides all around the station watching, thinking himself unseen, his great numbers cloaked in the reeds and the cane brakes, the dense August foliage. He thinks we do not hear his rustling above the click and whir of cicadas, the low song of frogs at night, and so you must carry on your daily ritual, gather water as women do each day. Betray no fear, no hesitation in your step, no trembling of your hands as you dip your vessels at the mouth. Do not trample the late summer stream, rush and muddy the flow. Do not with nervous eye search the woods for the painted face, a tomahawk's glint in sunlight. Do not hurry furtive on the path or crowd one another to safety on your return. Comport yourself as if you had no other task this day, no difference than any other day. Imagine Miriam and her sisters dipping their amphora in the Nile, balancing the blessed cool on hip and head, steady salvation through these rough gates. So more fierce women from the frontier. All right. Let me read a few more. This is a poem. It's called The Speculators. And I mentioned that the Filson has a terrific collection of letters that have been transcribed, so you don't have to strain your eyes on the spidery handwriting of the 18th century. And over, I read letters that were accounts from land agents and surveyors back to their creditors and governors, kind of asking for more money and kind of what they were going to do to get more. In one letter I read, somebody makes a note that they think Daniel Boone is a scoundrel and he's moved his line too close to their line. And so there's quite a lot of real estate king-making going on. This is a real speculative business where men have been given warrants for service. They are hiring companies to go survey their 400 or 1,000 acres. But there are also preemptions and ways to buy them up and trade. And land in Kentucky, as probably some of you know, at this time was kind of a mess. There were surveyed plots that were, claimed 2 and 3 times over. You had to register the land with a land office. And the speculators were making money. So this is called The Speculators. You're going to notice something a little bit unusual about the sound of it, and it's a poem that's called a villanelle, and it's a form that has certain rules. Among them, that you're repeating certain rhymes in a certain order or certain words. So you're going to hear that. And it has epigraphs from 2 of the letters that I found. So these are direct quotes. The first is from a letter unidentified from Harrodsburg, 1780. And the writer says, "I will have more rich land or I will cease to be." And the second one comes from a letter from Isaac Height to his father, April 26, 1783. And he writes, "I have in contemplation a scheme." So this is just pretty naked greed. They're going to get as much of this stuff and all of its promise, and they're going to buy low and sell high and make a lot of money. And as you also know, not all of it came fairly. "We will have more rich land, or we will cease to be rightful lords of this pleasant land. Thus have we in contemplation a scheme for acquiring preemptions from those who cease to be, or those without improvements on their land, and so will be vulnerable to our scheme. Or in treating with what savage who may be reluctant to release his hunting lands, convince him sweetly to the fairness of our scheme. Or the disenfranchised who may wish to be themselves made liberated by our land, but will instead be indentured by our scheme. And if our creditors refuse to be expansive in their backing of our land, we will overrun their ledgers with our schemes. And for as long as our governors let us be, we will rule as masters of this land, territories gotten, stolen by our schemes. A vast country ours will always be." So after about 1790, certainly after statehood, there was not much land for the enterprising young family to go get in Kentucky. It had been bought up. And the McAfees weren't above this either. In reading one record, once they got all of their warrants, and again, 5 brothers, they've got warrants. Their father doesn't come with them. And there's a little bit of a gap in the history as to why. Their mother comes. She, at the age of, 60 years old, traipses across the mountains and settles with her boys. But the father doesn't come. At some point, he obviously dies. And apparently the McAfee brothers attempt to file a claim in their dead father's name. And I believe it was refused. So they weren't above a good scheme. Okay. So I'm going to read a poem that is what I would call a found poem. And this again comes from letters. And the poem appears on the page kind of oddly. In fact, if you're not familiar with a lot of very contemporary poetry, then you wouldn't think this was a poem because it appears in a big block on the page that's centered and justified both left and right. So it just looks like a block, like a letter, like a piece of paper. And it just consists entirely of fragments of excerpts written by individuals back to their families who live chiefly in Virginia. that I pulled from these papers. So it's called Settlers' Letters, 1780 through 92. And there's an epigraph that says, "Pray don't go to Kentucky to live." And this is Governor Patrick Henry, governor of Virginia, because Kentucky is Virginia at this point. Governor Patrick Henry to his sister Anne Christian, November 13th, 1782. So again, and some of these accounts are pretty horrific, particularly some wintertime accounts. And just, it was very dangerous and very brutal. And I don't want to downplay the savagery from the settlers, as well as the First Nation people whose land we were settling on. But it was very brutal. Settlers' Letters, 1780 to 92. Numbers must perish, lost every horse and cow, almost occasioned a famine, all the skin and flesh taken off their face by excessive cold. An unrelenting death hath deprived me, no protector, for want of provisions, no refuge to fly to in this world. My wound is mortal, death of our dear brother, nothing but the great mercy of God that preserved us. Few of our family is left. Violence of this winter. Little prospect have I of ever seeing my dear mammy in this world. 9 people were killed. I fear he has been taken. I have suffered much in this country and would to God it would end. My brother Simpson died this fall. I am afraid I shall never see you again. 4 men were killed. Many unconceivable difficulties. 15 near us have been killed. My hopes for that support are all blasted and vanished. We are 3 days out and spitting of blood. So I don't want to end on that. So I'm going to read 2 more. This was a really interesting source for this one. I don't often read this one, but I really like it. There was a letter, well, no. It was a transcription of an oral history, and there are a lot of those available in the Filson as well, oral histories that were done as the last of the first wave of settlers were dying. And these were done in the 1830s and 40s. And in this case, it's reminiscences of Simon Kenton, also a figure in early Kentucky history. And it's a document that just transcribes these reminiscences, and it's a little bit unusual. So the poem's called The Big Man. He's really tall. The Big Man, Reminiscences of Simon Kenton by a Relative and 2 Acquaintances. That he was the tallest of all the Kentons, that his father loved whiskey, that he killed a man when he was 16 over a girl, went to the wedding and shot him there in flood, that he changed his name for a while. And that business with Gertie, their capture by the Indians, that he was to be burned and Gertie did what he could, but then they, the Indians, decided to take him to where the Wyandottes were, his arm broke in a place or 2, that he was eventually set free, that he cared nothing for property, that he wore a small Q in the custom of what you would call FFV, First Families of Virginia, but that he cut it off, remember? Found it not very convenient, that he was reserved, a little different. That a group of Indian children once discovered him lying in a treetop, scouting expedition. They asked if he would hurt them, that he explained later, as with feeling for his own, no, I could never have hurt them children one bit. And one of the little surprises in that source, along with that last bit of language, was this business that he wore this little queue, the little ponytail, and that was a sort of affected thing that the First Families of Virginia did, and that he did that too. A curious sort of little insight, but the story struck me, and it was a wonderful serendipitous find to get those reminiscences. All right, so I'm going to end with a poem that chronologically takes place probably the same time that those reminiscences were recorded, which is this section on the pioneer jumps forward two generations here. And this was a story that I also read an account of in several places. So in the canon of Kentucky history that was being shaped in the 19th century, you see these repeating stories, like Daniel Boone rescuing his daughter and her friends, like the siege at Boonesboro and Bryant Station, and like this story, which seems to be far less dramatic, but was very important somehow. And it's a story about a little boy who gets lost and survives. And he survives for 10 days, and then he finds his way back. And this story is imagined as being told by that little boy when he's much older. So it felt like a really good way to end this section. It's called As the Boy Grows, So Grows the Tale. How he heard the gunshots on a warm afternoon while he and his friends foraged for chestnuts far from the station. How, fearing attack, they scattered like minnows. How he didn't stop running until he was nigh lost, and with dark creeping in, called and called, but never heard his fellows' hurrah, nor his father's high whistle. How he crawled into a hollow log, moss pulled up for a blanket, and how he slept that night, and the next night, and then 10 nights, wandering from rock house to root, to smooth bank of a creek bed, nose to chest like a fox or a bobcat, gathering herbs and leaves, tiny bitter berries, what sustenance might carry him one day more. How he caught a glittering fish with his bare hands, but twisting so it cut him and he threw it back. And how he was never, ever afraid. He will say to his grandsons, wide-eyed on the rug, mug of milk in their hands, never afraid, not even when he saw two bright eyes shining from a tangle of laurel. Was it a bear, he will ask them, drawing closer? Or an Indian? And the boys will cry out when he laughs, their hearts beating like birds, startled at the wild thing he had once become. So I'll stop there with my verse history of the Kentucky frontier. And I would love to take a few questions, talk a little bit more about the sources and et cetera.
Well, thank you so much for those really wonderful readings. And I'm so glad that we started out this series of NEH sponsored programming that we're going to be running throughout this year with poetry, because I really think that the thing that we're going to be able to show across all of these lectures that we're going to hold is really all of the different ways that history in the past can be used. And it doesn't have to just end up as a history book or an article in one of the Filson publications. So those are wonderful things and I love them very much. But I'm really glad that we could show the breadth here. So talk a little bit about your decision-making process. Why do you think that poetry is a great medium to deliver this type of history lesson to the reader?
Well, I think a couple of things. I do think it's engaging. I do think people like to hear stories, and this is one way to tell stories. It appeals to the senses and it makes it memorable. I think you have poetic license, which is a phrase that is thrown around a lot to sort of provide an excuse for any sort of deviation from the truth you want. But poetic license means that you are licensed now to access another truth, sort of the capital T truth. So the little boy lost. We don't know really what he did. We assume he did some of what I said because he managed to survive for 10 days, but we don't know exactly. And this brings it alive to say, this is a story of survival, of a young person and persistence. And there's also in that too, there was a real fear among the settlers that they're going to kind of go native. They're going to become wild. There were a lot of kidnappings, and there were a number of people who were kidnapped as children that stayed with the native tribes, chose not to come back, made lives for themselves. And there was a real fear. When I talked about racism, in a lot of ways, I'm talking about a racialized fear of the Native American people. I did not run across in my research accounts of slaveholding often. This is a little premature for that, although settlers did bring enslaved people across the mountains with them. But anyway, using poetry to tell these kinds of stories lets you access that capital T truth. I think it provides, it also, poetry and literature generally puts you there emotionally. You, for a moment, are there, and it allows your heart to beat fast in the way that probably those little boys listening to their grandfather were, or those mothers were. And that's also what connects us to the history. Yes, we can trace our genealogy. Yes, we can point to a kind of narrative of causation that says, oh, here's why I'm here. But to be there emotionally, poetry allows us to be there emotionally with those mothers, with those people inside the fort, with that little boy, with Jane McMichael McAfee, whose son that she's named for, the mighty chieftain of the original McAfees, dies, doesn't make it. So I think that poetry allows that.
Yes, I think that that opening poem was really resonant. It's one that certainly stuck with me. Thinking a little bit about place. Kentucky is really blessed with a number of contemporary poets who take inspiration from the state's past. Just in the past year or so, we've had Frank X. Walker and Alan Taylor come and speak to the Filson audiences. Why do you think Kentucky poets so often look to the state's past? What about this place?
Well, it's a past full of conflict, for one thing, and that makes good poetry. I have sometimes joked with my husband that I don't really have any poems about him because I don't have any conflict. Like, what would I say? Oh, I love you so much, and we've had a blessed life, and that's not a poem. So Kentucky is a place of great, terrific conflict. There is a lot of unresolved stuff. As a people, I think the Kentuckians are, a little bit fierce, a little bit contrary, and also I think that as the terrific music Scott had put together, that was wonderful. That was fantastic music. I also think we're a fairly musical people, and we have traditions of music coming from all kinds of cultures. And so there is that storytelling and, musical sense as part of our identity. But why the Kentucky as a place? I think the history is difficult. And I think, as I began investigating this, I would get questions about, so what's it about? What are you trying to say? And for a long time, I really did not know what I was getting at. But I do think a lot of what we saw happening in early Kentucky explains a lot of what we see now. I think what I write about in The Speculators, explains a lot of, Kentucky's divisiveness, and the land is also beautiful. And so writing about the places, thinking about those places in central Kentucky, and there are beautiful places in western Kentucky. It's not an area I'm familiar with. Eastern Kentucky is just gorgeous. There's such high contrast just in the visual landscape too. But I think you'd also find writers in the Midwest say beautiful things about the prairie. And, so that might be one partial explanation. But I also think that the fact that there's a tradition here means that when you step into Kentucky as a writer, you are stepping into a really rich tradition that you can be in conversation with. And one of the things I think Frank's done that's so tremendous with the Appalachian poets is to bring forward a tradition that was always there and to let it sing in a broader way.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I appreciate you commenting on the landscape, especially in that image that you showed of the Bryan Station women out there. And
Yeah,
what is this land? Kentucky has a lot of landscapes, but I don't
not
think
that
we've
one.
got something that reads as biblical Levant or Renaissance Italy. That one
Yeah, they're remarkable. They're remarkable images, and I think they were pretty popular. The other poem in the book is about Captain or Colonel Benjamin Logan rescuing Benjamin Harris, and it's another famous story. And the picture is just, like I said, full of anachronisms, and it's odd. And there's just some cows standing around, and there's no, I mean, a siege on a fort is a chaotic, violent thing, and the rescue itself, I think he actually rescued a dead man. And it just, it just doesn't sync up. But it's, again, part of that reconciling narrative of the 19th century that was so important.
Well, and that's what really struck home with me. And you talked about the creation of this, and it's a great term, this canon of Kentucky history in the 19th century, where these same set piece stories get repeated and embellished and retold by all of these amateur chroniclers who are it's a little bit oral history, it's a little bit embroidery of their own imaginations,
Right.
And I think it's really incredible because it shows the ways that those heroic themes that they found in Kentucky history, they visually put into a contemporary language that called back to a European and an old world style of romance or heroism or whatever.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about sources, and thank you so much for tying so many of the poems that you read into documents that you looked at the Filson and elsewhere. Really appreciate the verbal footnotes tonight. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the things that you might not have read about tonight, or maybe didn't make it into the book. What are some of the documents that you read that sort of create the background for all this?
Well, one of the most interesting, and this is a situation where I couldn't get a conflict out of it, but one of the documents that was just fascinating to me and really opened up a window on sort of the everyday life of folks, in the same way that poem about Simon Kenton, that little note that he wears this sort of affected little cue like the hoity-toity in Virginia do, and he does that, was I found a mathematics book, and it's a folio style, for one of the sons, James, of one of the original brothers. So yes, they're all named Samuel, James, Robert, George, and Samuel, James, George, and anyway, and William. One of them's killed really early on. And so there's a James, and his house is still standing in Mercer County, actually off 127, and I think it's still inhabited. So this would have been his son, and it was a little math portfolio, and in it were his math exercises, including word problems, math word problems. And I hope this doesn't traumatize anyone. I know word problems traumatized me, but they were about the 18th century. So, and they had to do with General Washington. So one of them had to do, I kid you not, with how far does General Washington have to travel if he's going to leave point X and get to point Y, and when will he meet his troops, right? It's like a train leaves from the station and so forth, only it's George Washington and he's traveling with his troops. Another problem, he had to convert money from shillings to federal money. And I thought that was really interesting, which says, okay, they were using both at that point. How many shillings, how much in federal money, and the word problem, if somebody's paid in shillings, how much is that in federal money? And I just thought, oh, poor little James, just like every other seventh grader everywhere, he has got to puzzle his way through, what time George Washington leaves and how long will it take him to get so many miles if he goes this many miles by foot in this long a time, and having to convert federal money into shillings and vice versa. So really loved that. And it was so exciting to find, but just couldn't make a poem out of it.
Well, yeah, I don't blame anybody for starting to use salt as money when you've got to convert pound shillings and pence.
Yeah.
I want to turn a little bit to your day job, right? Because
Oh.
you teach the next generation of Kentucky's creative writers, and so how would you guide students or anybody who's interested in using evidence from the past to fuel their creative work?
Well, so I do encourage, I'm at Spalding, which is just down the road from y'all. And so, I have encouraged students and directed them there. With the MFA program, we have a number of students from Kentucky, but also from all over the US. But in terms of, I can say a little bit about how it worked for me. And I tell students the same thing, which is give yourself plenty of time and be open to what you find. I think what makes this different as research from some of the folks that I saw come in there while I was working in the spring of 2018, there'd be a research fellow in there, and man, they were in there for 8 hours and they had a limited time and they are transcribing stuff on their laptop, and they know what they're after and they know what they're going for. And I had the leisure, first of all, because I'm in town, but also to just see what I find and be open to going down a rabbit hole, and to take careful notes. I'm not held to the same standards for documentation, although I've got acknowledgments and some references in the book, but I don't have to document in the way that a historian would be expected to. So I take careful notes, so I'm getting that language. I hand wrote things rather than laptop things, because getting that language into kind of my muscle memory helped me inhabit it a little bit. So I took notes like that. I compiled things, and the staff was very patient in bringing me all kinds of different stuff and seeing what I found. And so I think, going in without much of an agenda and being open to what you find, I think was really what made it successful. I think again, that was a real luxury because, again, I had quite a lot of time. I was grateful for a sabbatical release from Spalding, and then also, being in town, I could come periodically and work steadily and not worry about that. I think that a lot more, also, don't start writing too soon. I probably read and took notes for close to a month before I finally got a poem. And that, when I did get the poem, I was surprised at how much I knew. I think trying to write any of these without having read a lot of, for instance, the one about the women at Riot Station. I had read a lot in lots of places about what it was like in a siege and why they would need water because the rifles would be so hot, and what was going on, and what kinds of things that they carried water in. They didn't have just lots and lots of big jerry cans. They got to go out there with all kinds of stuff. So I get all that language, but that comes from a lot of reading and absorbing. So be open to what you might find, and don't start writing poems or your short fiction or whatever too soon. Wait till you know a lot.
That's one of the things that I think we've thought a lot about. This we talk a lot about in history circles is serendipity, the archive, right, where you never know where it's going to take you, and you can come in with your call list, and if you've got the time, and you don't just have to snap pictures or take your notes and then rush out to catch your plane, which is unfortunately the reality for lots of folks. But if you've got the time, you can really just sort of let those questions and those curious sentences and names that pop up, and you can follow them. And if you've got a good, deep collection like the Filson has, you can follow those trains for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think we struggle to replicate that when we produce digital collections, and that's one of the things that we're going to be doing with this NEH funding, is to present a lot of these same documents from this era in Kentucky history that are from our collections online, and being able to replicate that experience and provide that depth and that browsability, rather than a narrow keyword searchability and you get what you need and go, and it's this very transactional thing, is something that we've thought a lot about, and how we recreate that experience for somebody who can't make it to the Filson and be in.
Right. I mean, I had the leisure to come down 3 or 4 times a week for a whole afternoon over the course of about 6 months. I imagine people doing family history research also follow that kind of path. I knew what I was looking for, and I started to know more and more the more I researched, and I could sort things out. I'm working right now with some papers. I don't think it's going to be a poem, but it may be something more in the lyric essay department, with some family papers for the Lillard family, which some of whom are buried on my father's farm and also have an interesting history. And there's just a tremendous archive of letters there. And it has been sort of miraculous to hold the letters and to look at them carefully and to read them and to have so many of them. So I've been exploring some of those recently.
Well, whatever that ends up looking like when it comes out, we'll be happy to have you back and do a reading.
Awesome.
We are at time right now. The book is This Great Green Valley. Links in the chat, or go pick it up from Carmichael's. Lynnell Edwards, thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed being here.
All right, everybody have a good night.
Good night.